welcome back to the kitchen. Today we're going to be making Irish soda bread. I'll be using whole wheat flour, regular sugar, some salt, baking soda and baking powder. Into that mixture we'll be cutting in the butter, and I'll show you what I mean by cutting in if you don't know. And also it includes buttermilk and raisins. We're going to start with 2.5 cups of the flour, and I'm leveling it off like this. Keep this out because we need it later for when we knead the bread dough. Then we need 2 tablespoons of sugar. This is a teaspoon, by the way, just for comparison. If you can read that there. Sometimes you might see it abbreviated. Teaspoon is lowercase Tsp, and tablespoon is uppercase Tbsp. Now we need 1 teaspoon each of our baking soda and baking powder. Irish soda bread is a type of bread that's called quick bread, and quick breads are things like, they also include coffee cake and stuff like that. It's bread that you don't need yeast for. Instead, we're making it rise with the baking soda and the baking powder. The salt, half a teaspoon. I'm just going to take the teaspoon and guesstimate filling it halfway. And the whisk also helps make it a little bit more fluffy. Oh, I did forget to take out a pinch of the flour like I usually do to make it even lighter, since the whole wheat flour is more dense than white flour. So normally I take out a big pinch of the flour before I mix in the other ingredients, but it's too late now. So just the whisking we'll have to do to make it lighter and fluffier. Now we have to cut in our butter, and we're using 3 tablespoons of butter. The recipe does say you can also use margarine if you prefer. This recipe actually did come from the Crocker International Cookbook, I think was the book it came from. So it's marked 1, 2, 3, so I'm gonna cut there. Normally I just cut through the paper, but I actually have had this sitting out for a few hours to make sure it was room temperature. So it's gonna be too squishy to cut through the paper. So I'm just going to keep track of where it was and then cut it there. So then what did I mean by cut? So cutting the butter into the dry ingredients, you use a pastry cutter, which is this. Some people also use it for making meatloaf or hamburger. It's actually called a pastry cutter. So stuck immediately. Get off. Okay, then a couple of times during the process I stop and scrape off any butter that's still staying stuck on the pastry cutter. Okay. Oh, I should put my silicone mat underneath my bowl so it doesn't slide around as much. Okay, you're supposed to do this until it looks like fine crumbles. So there's still some sort of big crumbles in there. So I'm gonna go a little bit longer. Alright, that's probably about as good as we're gonna get. So we're gonna stop there. I mean, there's still some big ones, but you can only do so much. Alright, now we need to put in the buttermilk. And it's calling for 3/4 of a cup. And we also, after that, stir in the raisins and mix it together to make our dough. Raisins is calling for 1/3 cup. They're just raisins. It's not going to ruin it if you put in a little more or a little less. So I'm not really going to measure them. I'm just going to guesstimate the raisins. Now, I did talk in a previous video about how you're not technically supposed to use this kind of cup, like for dry measure cup for liquid ingredients. You're supposed to use the special liquid cup like this. But with this recipe, I find that I always have to add more buttermilk than they say anyway, probably because I'm using the whole wheat flour and it's more dense, so you do tend to need a little more liquid sometimes. So I'm not going to bother with this since I'm going to be adding extra anyway. It's not going to make or break it that it's slightly different. Okay, so I'm going to start with the 3/4 cup, just like they said. I just filled this about 3/4 full, maybe a little more. You could just mix this with your hands, but I'm not prepared to get quite that sloppy yet, so I'm going to start with my spatula. But then, of course, you do have to use your hands once you get to the kneading phase. So you can see this is still pretty dry looking. So that's why I normally have to add extra buttermilk. Oops. Alright, so you don't want to overdo it, obviously. So just a little bit more. If you don't feel confident of your ability to only add a little bit at a time, you could try actually measuring 1/4 cup at a time. If you're using the whole wheat flour like I am. If you're using white flour, you probably will be fine with the 3/4 cup buttermilk, I guess. I've only ever made it with the whole wheat. Okay, this is still really dry. Oh, and by the way, if you ever want to make this and you don't have buttermilk on hand, you can do a buttermilk substitute, and I will put that down in the description below. Okay, so it's still a little dry, but that's fine because we're going to be kneading it and it will all start to come together at that point. If I added even more buttermilk now, it would end up being too wet, probably, based on past experience. We'll know for sure once we dump it out and start kneading. Alright, let's put some of this stuff away. I'm going to seal my sugar up nice and tight so it doesn't end up hard as a rock. Alright, and I'm going to seal my flour up, not because it would be hard as a rock, but because it can actually go rancid, especially whole wheat flour, because it's got more of the good wheat stuff in there, which is good for you, but it does make it tend to go bad a little more easily than the white flour, which has all the good wheat stuff stripped away. That stuff's probably going to last forever. You can tell I'm not a white flour fan. So I'm going to put this nice and tight in my plastic bag, and then I actually store it in the freezer until I'm ready to bake again. Oh, damn it, I still needed that flour. Sometimes I get a little too into cleaning up. So I'm hoping you can see what I'm doing. Okay, that's probably a little bit heavily floured, not lightly floured, but I find that I tend to knead it or it'll just stick like crazy. Okay, I'm going to start mushing it down in the bowl first, just to make it come together a little bit, and I'm trying to get all this flour that's left in the bottom to stick into it. and become part of it. Right. And then sometimes I just give up on that. Put it like this and pat it a little bit flat, and then just dump the dry flour onto it. That is sticky. And then just fold it over. Alright. Let's try and not waste any of this. Okay, so now I'm going to knead it. So for kneading, what your goal with the kneading is to get more air. Part of your goal is to get a little more air into the dough, and the most important goal actually is to make the dough more elastic. So basically by kneading, you're activating the gluten in the dough, which is what makes the particles stick together. And it says to knead for about 2 minutes, I think. We might go a little longer. Whole wheat flour actually has less gluten, just naturally, than the white flour. So it might need a little extra kneading, I don't know, we'll see. So we just push your heels of your hands into it like this, rock back, fold over, turn it like a quarter turn or something like that, a quarter turn or a third of the way turn, and do it again. And now you can see it's starting to stick to my hands. So I'm going to move over to this part of the counter. Actually, you can't see there. So I'm going to brush this flour that was on that part of the counter over here to give me a little bit more flour. A little more flour. Not a lot. But seriously, try not to go too crazy on the flour, because then you can actually make your dough start to get too dry. And it can start to get almost sort of gummy. Which is why you have to be careful adding the liquid, because if you add too much liquid and it gets too wet, then you would have to add a bunch more flour to compensate for that. And that is likely to make you end up with gummy dough and gummy bread, and you don't want that. So just push the heels of your hands into it, fold over, rotate, do it again. Sorry bread, this is probably too much, but you are very sticky. Maybe I should have added even less buttermilk, but it really looked too dry. So anyways, that just means that keep in mind, even more so than what I already said before, that it might look like it's still too dry, but it really isn't too dry. Before you start the kneading process. It's okay, it'll be fine. Okay, now it feels like it's starting to come together. It's because it's getting a little bit less sticky, and it's sort of like elasticy pretty much, which is what we want. So now we need to shape this into an oval, which it kind of already is, but we need it to be a little bit flatter. Let's see what they say. Shape into a round loaf 6.5 inches in diameter. Okay, so my hand is about 6 inches, so we're going to make it a little bit flatter. Okay, now we're going to put this, once it's the right size, on our cookie sheet. It says place on a greased cookie sheet. Feel free to try that. I never have. I always just put it on a cookie sheet that has parchment paper on it. Okay, so now it says that we need to cut an X into this bread. If you've ever seen Irish soda bread loaves, they have that X on the top. So we do that with a floured knife. Keep it from sticking. And the X is supposed to be 3/4 of the way through the loaf. Now that's a lot. I don't usually do it quite that deep, but we'll do it fairly deep. Try to show you this without dumping it on the floor. I don't know if that's gonna work. There. Not gonna work. There, okay, maybe you can sort of see. Alright, there. Now we're gonna put it in our oven on 375 for 35 to 45 minutes, and what you're looking for is for it to be golden brown and it sounds kind of hollow when you tap it. So we'll be back in about 35 or so minutes. Okay, as you can see, our bread has come out of the oven. I did check on it part way through just to make sure it wasn't getting too brown on top. I did have it on the top rack to make sure it wouldn't definitely not get burned on the bottom. But I did check the top and it wasn't getting too brown. So I let it finish up the rest of the way, and you can see it looks nice and brown, not burnt, just nice and brown. But when you tap it, it sort of sounds hollow. So those two things are the main ways that you know that it's done. This bread is really, really nice for giving as a gift because it's nice and compact like this. You can just wrap it up in some plastic wrap or a bag and put a bow on it. People love to get that as a gift. It's also super good to eat it yourself. I really like to have mine with butter on it, or sometimes butter and honey, or even butter and cinnamon is also really good too. So let me know how you like your Irish soda bread. And I hope you enjoyed spending some time in the kitchen. Have a great rest of your week. See you next time. Bye!